Homeless black teen. Fixes stranger's car. Weeks later, he gets a Harvard letter. The November wind cut through Jaden Carter's worn jacket like a blade made of ice, but he barely noticed anymore. His fingers, stained with engine grease that never quite washed off, gripped the straps of his backpack as he walked past the Riverside grocery store parking lot. The weight of his beat-up toolbox inside the bag pressed against his spine. 23 pounds of salvation he'd collected piece by piece from junkyards, garage sales, and the occasional generous mechanic who understood what it meant to have nothing but still want to fix everything. At 17, Jaden had learned that broken things could be mended if you understood how they worked, if you had patience, if you refused to give up. Everything except families, apparently. Everything except homes that stayed yours. The shelter would open its doors in 3 hours, and until then, the public library was warm enough if you pretended to study. But that's when he heard it, the desperate, grinding attempt of an engine trying to turn over, followed by a woman's frustrated voice carrying across the cold afternoon air. The silver sedan sat crooked in the parking spot, hood already popped, steam rising like a ghost into the gray sky. A woman in her 30s stood beside it, phone pressed to her ear, designer coat pulled tight around her shoulders. Her face showed the particular kind of panic that comes from being stranded in an unfamiliar place with somewhere important to be. Jaden knew he should keep walking. The library closed at 8, and he needed those hours to finish his calculus homework, to maintain the 4.0 GPA that was his only ticket to anywhere better than here. But his feet had already changed direction, carrying him toward the car because fixing things was the one language he spoke fluently in a world that often didn't want to hear him at all. "Excuse me, ma'am," he called out, keeping his voice gentle, non-threatening, the way he'd learned to approach strangers who might see a young black man and think danger instead of help. "Sounds like your cooling system might be having issues. I could take a look if you want." Amelia Brooks turned toward the voice, her initial wariness melting into desperate hope when she saw the earnest face of the teenager before her. His clothes were clean but worn thin, patches of different fabric sewn carefully where tears had been mended. Despite the cold, his eyes held a warmth that reminded her of her grandfather, who used to say that kindness was the only currency that never lost its value. "I don't want to trouble you," she started, but even as she spoke, the rental car company was telling her it would be at least 2 hours before someone could come. 2 hours she didn't have. The conference at Harvard, where she was supposed to speak about educational equity and access, started in 90 minutes, and the irony of missing it because of car trouble wasn't lost on her. "It's no trouble," Jaden said, already setting down his backpack and pulling out the toolbox that had become his most prized possession. "Let me just check a few things first. Sometimes it's something simple." He moved with the confidence of someone 3 times his age, fingers dancing over hoses and connections, checking fluid levels, listening to the engine's complaints like a doctor with a stethoscope. 20 minutes passed like flowing water, with Jaden working in focused silence while Amelia watched, fascinated. She pulled out her phone, initially to check the time, but found herself recording instead. There was something mesmerizing about watching him work, the way he diagnosed the problem by touch and sound, how he explained each step in simple terms when she asked questions, never talking down to her, never assuming she wouldn't understand. The split radiator hose revealed itself like a confession, and Jaden's face lit up with the particular joy of finding a problem he could solve. "See this crack here?" He showed her, running his finger along the damaged rubber. "That's your culprit. Lost pressure, engine overheated, safety system shut everything down to prevent damage." From his toolbox came a clamp he'd salvaged from a junkyard the week before, cleaned and oiled until it looked almost new. His movements were precise, practiced, born from years of watching YouTube videos in the library, volunteering at Marcus's community garage every Saturday, learning that machines were honest in ways people sometimes weren't. The engine purred to life on the first try, smooth and grateful, and Amelia's relief was so profound she actually laughed. "You're a miracle worker," she said, reaching for her purse. "Please, let me pay you for your time and expertise." But Jaden was already packing up his tools, shaking his head with a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. No payment necessary, ma'am. Just glad I could help. You should make your appointment now. Something in the way he hefted his backpack, too carefully, too protectively, made her pause. The way his stomach growled softly in the quiet moment between them. The calculation in his eyes as he checked his watch, not for the time, but for how many hours until something. Wait, she said. At least let me buy you dinner. There's a diner right there, and I have time now thanks to you. The no was already forming on his lips when she added, Please, you'd be doing me a favor. I hate eating alone, and you just saved my entire presentation. Inside Murphy's diner, over plates of meatloaf and mashed potatoes that Jaden tried not to devour too quickly, the story came out in pieces. Not all at once, he was too proud for that, but in careful admissions between bites. How he'd been at the shelter for 8 months since his grandmother passed, the only family who'd ever wanted him. How he kept his textbooks in a locker at school because carrying them made his backpack too heavy when he had to move quickly. How he maintained straight A's because education was the only door he could see that might lead somewhere else, even if he couldn't afford to walk through it. Amelia listened with the skill of someone who'd spent years in boardrooms learning to hear what wasn't being said. She heard the careful omissions, the pride that wouldn't let him say he was hungry, the fear that wouldn't let him admit how scared he was of aging out of the youth shelter system in 6 months with nowhere to go. Tell me about the garage where you volunteer, she prompted gently, and his entire demeanor changed. His eyes lit up as he described Marcus, the owner who'd taken a chance on a 14-year-old kid who hung around asking questions. How he'd learned to rebuild transmissions, diagnose electrical problems, understand that every strange sound had a story to tell. Marcus says I have the gift, Jaden said quietly, then quickly added, but lots of people can fix cars. What I really want is to learn how to design them, make them better, more efficient. Electric vehicles that people in neighborhoods like mine can actually afford. He pulled out a notebook from his backpack, pages filled with sketches and calculations, designs for hybrid systems that could be retrofitted into older vehicles. MIT has this program, he continued, then stopped himself. But that's just dreaming. Need to be realistic. The word realistic sat between them like a stone, heavy with all the dreams it had killed before they could take flight. Amelia Brooks had built her career on recognizing potential in unexpected places. As a Harvard alumna who now worked in venture capital, she'd learned that the best innovations came from people who'd lived the problems they were trying to solve. But more than that, she recognized in Jaden something she'd seen in herself once. A brilliant mind trapped by circumstances needing just one person to see past the surface. Show me your transcripts, she said suddenly. Your real grades, any test scores you have. Jaden hesitated, then pulled out a folder he kept protected in a plastic sleeve. Perfect grades despite everything. SAT scores in the 98th percentile, taken once with a fee waiver, no expensive prep courses. Letters of recommendation from teachers who called him exceptional, resilient, once in a generation. Why haven't you applied to colleges? She asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Application fees, he said simply. $50, $75 each. That's food for 2 weeks. And even if I got in somewhere, then what? I age out of the shelter at 18. Can't study if you don't have anywhere to sleep. That night, Amelia Brooks didn't sleep. Instead, she made phone calls. To her roommate from Harvard who now worked in admissions. To the professor who'd mentored her and still remembered every student who'd ever shown real promise. To the foundation she served on that specifically helped brilliant students from underserved communities. She sent the video she'd taken of Jaden fixing her car, along with photos of his notebook designs, his transcripts, everything that painted a picture of a young man who deserved a chance. I'm not asking for special treatment, she told each person. I'm asking you to look at someone special who might otherwise be overlooked. The responses came faster than expected. Interest, genuine excitement. A request for a full application, fees waived. Someone mentioned a new program for students experiencing housing instability. Full support from day one. Another called about a summer bridge program that started with housing in June, 2 months before regular freshmen arrived. Jaden knew none of this. He went back to his routine, shelter at night, school during the day, the garage on Saturdays, library in between. But something had shifted in him after that dinner. Not hope exactly, because hope was a luxury he couldn't afford. More like a small crack in the wall he'd built around his dreams, letting in just a sliver of light. He threw himself into his studies with renewed intensity, as if preparing for something he couldn't name. His physics teacher noticed him staying later, asking deeper questions. Marcus at the garage watched him tackle more complex repairs, pushing himself to understand not just how to fix things but why they broke in the first place. 3 weeks passed, then 4. The days grew shorter, colder. Jaden's 18th birthday approached like a deadline, carrying with it the reality of aging out of the shelter system. He'd started looking for night jobs, anything that would let him finish high school during the day and maybe save enough for community college courses. It was a Thursday afternoon, gray and ordinary, when everything changed. Jaden had just returned to the shelter after school, planning to grab his things and head to the library when Ms. Patricia at the front desk called his name. "Package for you, honey," she said, holding up a thick envelope with a crimson crest that made his heart stop. Harvard University, Office of Admissions. His hands shook as he took it, the weight of it feeling impossible. Thick envelopes meant yes, thin ones meant no. But this couldn't be real because he hadn't even applied. Had he? He sat on the shelter's front steps, the cold concrete beneath him anchoring him to reality as he opened the envelope with careful fingers, as if it might dissolve if he moved too quickly. Inside, the letter began with words he'd only dreamed of reading. "Dear Mr. Carter, it is with great pleasure that we inform you of your acceptance to Harvard University." The words blurred as tears came, hot and sudden. Full scholarship, housing guaranteed, summer bridge program with a stipend, work-study position with the engineering department, everything, more than everything. At the bottom, a handwritten note from the Dean of Admissions. "Ms. Brooks shared your story with us, but your achievements speak for themselves. Students like you are exactly why Harvard exists. We can't wait to see what you'll build." His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. When he opened it, the message was simple. "Told you the engine had more in it. Proud of you, kid. Amelia P.S. Check your email. There's information about a laptop program and a book fund. Also, Marcus knows. He's already planning your going-away party." Jaden sat there on those cold steps, grease still under his fingernails from helping someone with their bike that morning, and laughed through his tears. Not the bitter laugh he'd perfected to hide pain, but something real and free and soaring. Miss Patricia found him there an hour later, still holding the letter, still staring at it as if it might disappear. "Baby, you okay?" she asked, sitting down beside him despite her bad hip. He showed her the letter, watched her face transform from concern to joy to something fierce and proud. "I knew it," she said, pulling him into a hug that smelled like vanilla and hope. "Knew you were meant for big things from the day you walked in here, organizing the other kids' homework help, fixing that broken washer with a butter knife and some wire." Word spread through the shelter like wildfire. Other kids came to congratulate him, to touch the letter like it was a talisman, proof that impossible things could happen. David, who was 15 and angry at the world, asked quietly if Jaden would help him with his algebra before he left. Maria, who never spoke above a whisper, wanted to know if he'd write to them from college. They looked at him differently now, not with envy, but with something he'd never seen before. Possibility reflected in their eyes. Marcus closed the garage early when Jaden told him, something he'd never done in 15 years of business. "Harvard," he kept saying, shaking his head with a grin that wouldn't quit. "My boy's going to Harvard." He pulled out a wrapped box from under the counter, something he'd been saving. Inside was a professional-grade diagnostic tablet, the kind real mechanics used. "For when you come back and revolutionize this whole industry," Marcus said gruffly, turning away to wipe his eyes. "Because you will come back, right? Not to stay, but to show these kids that someone from here made it out and up." Jaden nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He understood what Marcus meant. Success wasn't just about leaving. It was about creating a path others could follow, about proving that zip codes and circumstances didn't have to be destinies. That night, Jaden couldn't sleep. He walked to the garage where Marcus had given him a key years ago, let himself in, and sat in the familiar smell of motor oil and possibility. He thought about his grandmother, who'd worked 3 jobs to keep their tiny apartment, who'd made him promise to be more than his circumstances. He thought about his mother, somewhere out there, lost to addiction before he could remember her face. He thought about all the nights he'd wondered if being smart was enough when you had nothing else. And now he thought about Amelia Brooks, who'd seen him not as a charity case but as someone worth investing in. He pulled out his notebook and began sketching. Not car designs this time, but plans. A nonprofit that would teach kids in the shelter basic repair skills. A scholarship fund for application fees. A mentorship program connecting kids who had nothing with people who remembered what that felt like. The next morning brought a second surprise. Amelia had connected him with a family in Cambridge who had a small apartment over their garage. They needed someone to help with maintenance and snow removal in exchange for reduced rent. It would be his for the summer program and beyond, a real address, a place to receive mail without shame. The woman, Mrs. Chen, had even offered to teach him to cook, saying she missed having young people around since her own kids had grown. "Every brilliant mind needs a good meal," she'd said on the phone, her voice warm with the kind of maternal care Jaden had forgotten existed. It was almost too much, this sudden reversal of fortune. He'd learned to survive on nothing, to expect less and be grateful for crumbs. Now he had to learn something harder, how to accept abundance, how to believe he deserved it. The story spread beyond the shelter. A local news station picked it up, then national outlets. Homeless teen accepted to Harvard after fixing stranger's car became a headline that made Jaden uncomfortable even as it opened more doors. Donations poured into the shelter. Other kids got opportunities. Internships, scholarships, mentors who saw the story and wanted to help. Marcus's garage was flooded with customers who'd heard about the kid who worked there, and Marcus used the extra income to hire 2 more youth from the shelter, training them like he'd trained Jaden. The ripple effects spread outward like fixing that radiator hose had somehow repaired something much bigger, connecting people who'd never have met otherwise, creating a network of support that hadn't existed before. On his last night at the shelter, they threw him a party. Nothing fancy. Cake from the grocery store, decorations made by the younger kids, music from someone's phone speaker. But it was everything. Miss Patricia gave a speech that had everyone crying, talking about how Jaden had tutored kids, fixed everything from hair dryers to the ancient dishwasher, never asked for anything in return. "You showed these babies that being poor doesn't mean being less than," she said. "That's a gift bigger than Harvard, honey." David had made him a card with MIT Next written in careful letters inside. Maria sang a song she'd written about flying. Even the staff members who usually stayed professional were wiping their eyes. Jaden stood there, surrounded by people who'd become family in the hardest time of his life, and realized that leaving would be harder than he'd thought. Success meant saying goodbye to the people who'd held you up when you had nothing to stand on. The morning he left for Cambridge was bright and cold, spring fighting its way through winter's last grip. His possessions fit in 2 suitcases and his precious backpack with the toolbox that had started everything. Marcus drove him to the train station in the shop truck, talking the whole way about torque specifications and customer service to avoid talking about feelings. At the platform, the older man pulled him into a hug that said everything words couldn't. "You remember where you came from," Marcus said roughly, "and you remember that getting out isn't the same as getting away. You carry us with you now. Do us proud." Jaden nodded, unable to trust his voice. As the train pulled away, he watched the city that had been both prison and teacher fade into distance, knowing he'd return different but never disconnected. Cambridge in summer was like stepping into a different world. Tree-lined streets, buildings older than anything he'd known, students walking with the confidence of people who'd never wondered where they'd sleep. The summer bridge program housed them in a dorm that felt impossibly luxurious. His own bed, a desk, a closet for clothes he didn't yet own. His roommate, Thomas, was from rural Alabama, first in his family to finish high school, much less go to college. They bonded over feeling like imposters, over staying up late to do work that prep school kids finished in half the time, over the shock of professors who actually wanted to hear what they thought. "We're not behind," Thomas said one night after they'd both struggled with a writing assignment. "We just took a different road to get here. Might have more potholes, but the view's probably more interesting." The classes were harder than anything Jaden had encountered, but not in the way he'd expected. The academic work was challenging but manageable. Years of self-study in the library had prepared him for that. What was hard was learning to speak up in discussions, to believe his perspective mattered as much as kids who'd grown up debating at dinner tables. Hard was accepting help from tutors without feeling ashamed. Hard was walking into the dining hall and not calculating the cost of every item on his plate. Professor Williams, who taught Introduction to Engineering, noticed him hanging back after class, questions unasked. "Mr. Carter," she said one day, "your questions aren't bothering anyone. They're making everyone think harder. That's why you're here." She assigned him to a research project on sustainable transportation, where his practical knowledge suddenly became an asset. Other students had theories. Jaden had actually rebuilt engines, understood the gap between what looked good on paper and what worked under a hood. Amelia visited in July, taking him to lunch at a restaurant where the napkins were cloth and the water had lemon slices. "How are you really?" she asked, cutting through pleasantries. He told her about the imposter syndrome, the moments of panic when he forgot where he was and thought he'd wake up back at the shelter, about the professor who'd asked where he'd prepped and how to answer the public library and YouTube without shame, about making friends who complained about their parents' expectations while he carried the weight of having no one to disappoint but himself. "That's not true," she said firmly. "You have Miss Patricia, Marcus, all those kids at the shelter looking up to you. And me, but here's the thing. You don't owe any of us success. You owe yourself the chance to try. Everything else is extra." She pulled out her phone and showed him a photo, David from the shelter, grinning over a math test marked A+. "He said to tell you he's coming for your spot. Better watch out." The summer flew by in a blur of classes, study groups, and slowly building confidence. Jaden found his people, other students who'd taken unconventional paths, who understood that intelligence came in different packages. He joined the Society of Black Engineers, where upperclassmen shared not just academic advice but survival strategies for navigating predominantly white institutions. He started tutoring other summer bridge students in math and physics, discovering he had a gift for explaining complex concepts in simple terms. His advisors suggested he consider teaching as well as engineering. "The best innovators are often the best teachers," she said. "They understand how to make knowledge accessible." By August, when the regular academic year approached, Jaden no longer felt like he was pretending to belong. He'd earned his place through late nights and early mornings, through asking questions and offering answers, through bringing a perspective that textbooks couldn't teach. His first day of regular classes, walking across Harvard Yard with a backpack full of books he owned instead of borrowed, Jaden felt the weight of everyone who'd helped him get there. He thought about his grandmother, who'd died believing he'd make something of himself even when he couldn't see how, about the teachers who'd stayed late to explain concepts again and again, about Marcus, who'd paid him under the table when business was slow so he'd have lunch money, about Miss Patricia, who'd bent shelter rules so he could stay past curfew to study, about Amelia, who'd seen potential in a stranger with greasy hands and a willingness to help, and about all the kids still at the shelter, still believing that maybe, possibly, if Jaden could do it, they could too. That evening, he video-called the shelter from his dorm room. They'd set up the computer in the common room, and dozens of faces crowded into frame. He gave them a tour of his room, the library, the engineering lab where he'd be working. David asked about homework. Maria wanted to know if people were nice. Miss Patricia just smiled, proud and teary. "Y'all seeing this?" she told the kids. "This is what's possible. This is what happens when you don't give up on yourself, even when the world gives up on you." After the call, Jaden sat at his desk and opened his engineering textbook. On the first page, he wrote a promise. "For everyone still fighting to get out, to get up, to get through. This is just the beginning." Outside his window, Cambridge glowed with possibility. But his heart remained tied to a shelter in a forgotten part of the city, where dreams were luxuries and Harvard letters were miracles. The semester unfolded like a complex equation, gradually revealing its solution. Jaden threw himself into his studies with the same intensity he'd once reserved for survival. Thermodynamics, calculus, computer-aided design, subjects that would have seemed impossibly abstract a year ago now connected to real experiences. When professors talked about heat transfer, he thought about radiators and cooling systems. When they discussed material stress, he remembered learning to recognize when a part was about to fail by the sound it made. His unique perspective often led to insights that surprised even his professors. During a discussion about electric vehicle adoption barriers, he raised his hand and talked about his neighborhood, where people drove 20-year-old cars not by choice but by necessity. Innovation isn't just about making better technology, he said. It's about making it accessible to people who need it most. The room fell silent, then erupted in discussion. After class, 3 students approached him about starting a project focused on affordable retrofitting solutions. October brought unexpected challenges. Midterms coincided with news from the shelter. They were losing funding, might have to close the youth wing. Jaden couldn't concentrate, couldn't stop thinking about kids like David and Maria with nowhere to go. He considered taking a semester off, getting a job, sending money back. It was Amelia who talked him down during a late-night phone call. "You can't save everyone by sacrificing yourself," she said gently. "But you can save more people by finishing what you started. Success isn't abandonment. It's building a ladder others can climb." She was already working her network, finding emergency funding, connecting the shelter with corporate sponsors. By November, not only was the shelter saved, but they'd secured funding for a new educational program. Computer labs, tutoring, college prep. They named it the Carter Initiative, which made Jaden cry alone in his dorm room, overwhelmed by the weight of becoming a symbol when he still felt like that scared kid with a toolbox. Winter in Cambridge was brutal, but Jaden had survived worse. He walked to class through snow that reminded him of nights when the shelter had been full, when he'd ridden the subway all night to stay warm. Now he had a warm coat, bought with money from his work-study job in the engineering lab. He had friends who invited him home for Thanksgiving when he mentioned staying on campus. He had professors who saw potential worth nurturing. Dr. Chen, who taught sustainable design, became a mentor, pushing him to think bigger. "You're not just solving technical problems," she told him. "You're solving human problems. Never forget that." Under her guidance, he began developing a business plan for a nonprofit that would train underserved youth in green technology repair and installation. It was ambitious, maybe impossible, but she taught him that the best ideas always seemed impossible at first. The story of his acceptance to Harvard had continued to ripple outward in ways he never expected. Letters arrived from kids across the country who'd read about him, asking for advice, sharing their own struggles. He tried to answer them all, staying up late to write responses that were honest but encouraging. "The path isn't straight," he wrote to a girl in Detroit who was living in her car while finishing high school. "Sometimes it doubles back, sometimes you have to rest, sometimes you need help carrying the load. That's not weakness, that's human." He started a blog, sharing study tips, resources for free educational materials, lists of programs that waived fees. It grew quickly, becoming a community of strivers and survivors, proof that poverty didn't mean powerlessness. Marcus contributed posts about trade skills, Amelia about navigating corporate spaces, Ms. Patricia about maintaining hope when everything seemed hopeless. Spring semester brought new confidence and new opportunities. Jaden joined a research team working on battery technology for electric vehicles, his practical knowledge complementing theoretical expertise. He still felt out of place sometimes at networking events and formal dinners, still had moments of panic in expensive stores where nothing had price tags. But he'd learned to navigate these spaces without losing himself. His friends, a mix of scholarship kids and wealthy students who saw past surfaces, became his translators, teaching him unwritten rules while learning from his perspective. His roommate Thomas and he started a support group for first-generation college students, creating the community they'd wished existed when they arrived. "We're not just trying to survive Harvard," Thomas said at their first meeting. "We're trying to thrive here and bring others with us." One day in April, walking across campus, Jaden was stopped by a younger student, nervous and eager. "Are you Jaden Carter?" the boy asked. "The one who fixed the car?" It felt strange being recognized, being seen as someone worth knowing. The boy, Luis, was a high school junior from Boston, touring colleges he thought he'd never afford to attend. His teacher had told him Jaden's story, suggested he reach out. They spent the afternoon together, Jaden showing him labs and libraries, but more importantly, showing him it was possible to imagine himself there. "I still wake up some days thinking it's a dream," Jaden admitted. "But even if it is, I'm going to make the most of it until I wake up." Luis left with application fee waivers and a promise that Jaden would review his essays. Later, sitting in his dorm room, Jaden realized he'd become what he'd needed, proof that circumstances weren't destiny, that broken things could be rebuilt stronger. As freshman year drew to a close, Jaden stood in the same spot where he'd first set foot on campus, marveling at how much had changed and how much remained the same. He still carried his toolbox in his backpack, still had grease under his fingernails from helping friends fix bikes and laptops. But now he also carried knowledge, connections, and possibilities he couldn't have imagined. His grades were strong, his professors supportive, his future no longer a narrow corridor but a wide-open field. The summer internship he'd secured with an electric vehicle startup would pay more than he'd ever made. Enough to send some back to the shelter, to help David with his own college applications, to start saving for the nonprofit he planned to launch after graduation. But money had never been the real goal, just a tool like any other, useful only in what it could fix or build. The day before heading home for summer, though home was a complex concept when you'd never really had one, Jaden received a package. Inside was a new set of professional-grade tools from Marcus, each piece engraved with his initials. The note was simple. "For the builder, not just the fixer. Proud of you, son." That word, son, hit harder than any acceptance letter. He thought about fathers he'd never known, families he'd never had, and realized family wasn't just about blood or houses. It was about people who saw you at your lowest and still believed in your highest. It was Miss Patricia checking on him every week, Amelia sending job opportunities and bad jokes, Thomas staying up to quiz him before tests, professors who pushed because they cared. It was even the broken cars and desperate drivers who'd unknowingly given him purpose when he'd had nothing else. Returning to his old neighborhood for the summer felt like time travel. Everything looked smaller, more worn, but also more precious. The shelter kids treated him like a celebrity and a big brother combined, pestering him with questions and dreams. He spent mornings at his internship, learning about cutting-edge technology, and afternoons at Marcus's garage, teaching kids what he'd learned. The contrast should have been jarring, but instead it felt like completion, two halves of a whole life coming together. He helped David with SAT prep, taught Maria basic coding, showed the younger kids that college wasn't a fantasy but a plan requiring steps they could start taking now. Ms. Patricia watched him work with quiet satisfaction. "You came back," she said one evening. "Not everyone does." "I never really left," he replied, and meant it. The shelter, the garage, the struggle, they weren't things to escape but foundations to build on. One hot July afternoon, a familiar silver sedan pulled into Marcus's garage. Amelia Brooks stepped out smiling at Jaden's shock. "Thought my car could use a checkup from Harvard's finest," she said with a wink. As he checked her perfectly maintained engine, she told him about the scholarship fund she'd started, specifically for students aging out of foster care and shelter systems. "I need someone to help run it," she said casually. "Someone who understands the real challenges, not just the statistics." "Interested?" It was overwhelming, the way opportunities kept appearing, as if that one moment of fixing a stranger's car had set off a chain reaction that wouldn't stop. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why did you do all this for someone you didn't even know?" She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Because someone did it for me once. Different circumstances, same principle. We don't rise alone, Jaden. We rise together, or we don't rise at all." As summer turned toward fall and his sophomore year approached, Jaden found himself back on that train to Cambridge, but everything was different now. His suitcases were fuller, his confidence stronger, his purpose clearer. He carried letters from the shelter kids, photos from the garage, and a promise to keep building bridges between the world he'd come from and the one he was entering. The toolbox still sat in his backpack, but now it represented more than survival. It was a reminder that everything could be fixed if you understood how it broke. That helping strangers wasn't just kindness, but investment in a future where no brilliant kid got left behind because of their zip code. Through the train window, he watched the landscape change from urban decay to suburban comfort to academic privilege. And instead of feeling like he was leaving something behind, he felt like he was carrying it all with him, ready to build something new from all the broken pieces he'd collected along the way. His phone buzzed with a text from David. "Got into the advanced placement program. They said my essay about you was what convinced them. Thanks for showing me it was possible." Then another from Maria. "Performed my song at the talent show. Didn't win, but didn't run away either. Flying is hard, but worth it." And finally, from Amelia. "Saw a kid helping someone with their car today. Made me think of you. The ripples keep spreading." Jaden smiled, thinking about ripples and radiator hoses, about how small fixes could lead to enormous changes. As the train carried him toward his future, he pulled out his notebook and began sketching again. Not just car designs now, but entire systems. Ways to convert desperation into determination, poverty into power, breakdown into breakthrough. The homeless black teen who'd fixed a stranger's car was becoming something more, something necessary. An engineer not just of machines but of possibilities. Proof that Harvard letters could find their way to shelter doorsteps. That toolboxes could open doors to ivory towers. That every broken thing carried within it the seed of something better. The title of his story, Homeless Black Teen Fixes Stranger's Car. Weeks later, he gets a Harvard letter. Would follow him through newspaper articles and speaking engagements through graduation and beyond. But for Jaden, the real story wasn't in the headline. It was in the quiet moments between the drama, the late nights studying by shelter lamplight, the early mornings at the garage learning that competence was its own currency, the thousand small kindnesses from strangers who became family. It was in understanding that success wasn't about leaving poverty behind but about transforming it into purpose, that education wasn't escape but equipment for return and repair. As Cambridge came into view, golden in the afternoon light, Jaden Carter gripped his toolbox and prepared for another year of building. Not just a future for himself, but a pathway wide enough for everyone still walking behind him, tools in hand, ready to fix whatever broke along the way.